Deep beneath the earth, a golden death mask has lain untouched for 4,000 years, its surface gleaming like a trap of light in endless darkness. Each flake of gold pressed over closed eyelids was meant not just to guide a soul to the gods, but to conceal the rot sealed within. Beneath the linen wraps, a spine twisted like a dying river, teeth jutting forward like crumbling walls, silent witnesses to a boy who did not fall to war or plague, but whose own bloodline strangled his lungs from within. In the maze of this tomb, a flicker of torchlight catches frozen memories. A teenage pharaoh forcing himself upright on crippled feet, gasping through a misshapen chest. A crown heavier than his crooked bones could bear. Every step he dragged across the marble courtyard left behind an invisible trail, a curse woven strand by strand through parents, grandparents, ancestors who worshiped purity more than breath. Above this tomb, Egypt's sands still burn under the sun, but deep in this cold chamber, the oldest secret leaks through every crack etched with the face of Ra. There are no screams here, no funeral drums. Only a final breath snuffed out, sealed beneath hammered gold. Centuries later, the scalpel of science would cut open his silence, and truth would gleam brighter than treasure. Gold burying rot, a throne paid for with splintered bone. Before we dive into the forgotten stories of survival and suffering, if you enjoy learning about the hidden truths of history, consider liking and subscribing for more content like this. And please comment below to let me know where you're listening from. I find it wonderful that we're exploring these ancient stories from different parts of the world, together connected across time and space by our shared curiosity about the past. Long before the mask sealed shut over the last breath, before a teenage king stumbled under the weight of gold and prophecy, the seed of this tragedy was planted in temples carved with sun gods and jackal-headed guardians. It began not as a plot of murder, but as a promise of purity. The first kings of the Nile saw themselves not merely as rulers, but as walking gods, flesh and blood incarnations of Horus and Ra. In a world where sand devoured cities and the river could drown fields overnight, power needed a myth heavy enough to bind generations to the throne. Somewhere along the fertile banks where reeds whispered secrets to the wind, an early pharaoh looked upon his sister and saw not a sibling, but the only vessel worthy of holding divine blood. To him, the farmer sweating under the sun, the craftsman chiseling stone for tombs that would outlive them, all these people were necessary, but not equal. Mortal blood, he believed, would tarnish the line gifted by gods. And so the walls rose higher, not just of stone, but of flesh walls built by marriage beds that closed the royal body off from the world outside. Priests draped in linen and secrets nodded in approval. To them, each sibling union was a covenant that made the gods smile. Advisors whispered of how this sealed the throne against foreign claim, how it locked power within granite walls no commoner could breach. The child born of sister and brother would be closer to the divine than any conqueror's blade could ever reach. That was the theory. What they did not see, or refused to see, was the hidden tax each generation paid, written not in coins, but in bone and blood. In the earliest courts, small deformities were called sacred marks. A prince's jutting jaw, a princess's wide hips, all signs, said the priest, that Ra's essence shaped their flesh differently from ordinary people. The first clubfoot was not a warning, but a divine quirk. An infant's early death became an offering, the gods reclaiming a spirit too holy for earth's dust. Every defect, every fragile breath, every stillborn child was folded neatly into ritual and prophecy. So the cycle deepened, layer by layer, like silt settling in the riverbed. What began as doctrine hardened into culture. What should have been seen as human fragility was recast as holy design. As centuries unspooled, sandstone temples rose above the desert like jagged teeth. In the shadows of these monuments, royal children played among painted columns, unaware they were inheriting not only crowns, but a curse. They chased each other through gardens perfumed with lotus and myrrh, boys and girls who would one day share more than childhood laughter. No scroll warned them of what grew hidden in their veins, recessive traits stacking like debts with compound interest no treasury could repay. Behind the palace gates, the illusion of invincibility flourished. Gold masks, granite statues, and colossal tombs screamed eternity, but inside royal nurseries, fragile lungs wheezed, spines bent, skulls elongated in slow protest. Mothers draped in fine linen and weighed down by amulets promising safe births gave themselves again and again to this cycle, praying their next child would not bear the same marks etched into marble ancestors. In dusty scribes' chambers, court physicians documented fevers and twisted limbs, but their parchments never named the culprit. Their quills scratched prayers disguised as medicine, poultices for bones that would not straighten, incantations for spines that bowed under invisible burdens. Meanwhile, priests praised each surviving heir as proof the gods favored the bloodline, even as each birth delivered another link in a chain of genetic ruin. Through centuries, the river of gold widened. Foreign envoys brought tribute. Pyramids rose, records were carved deeper, and yet the walls of flesh remained locked. Now and then, a clever pharaoh broke the cycle, wedding a foreign bride, a Libyan princess, a Nubian queen. For a generation, fresh blood diluted the poison. A prince might stand taller, breathe easier, bear children of stronger bone. But power despises dilution. When the kingdom stabilized, the walls closed again. Priests reminded the next pharaoh that only a sister's womb could keep the throne safe. The cycle tightened once more. From that first union of brother and sister sprouted a dynasty that called its deformities divine. The priests called it devotion. The rulers called it destiny. But beneath the marble floors and painted tombs, the truth waited like a snake beneath warm sand. The very blood they prized as sacred was becoming a venom that no incantation could purge. Long before the boy king gasped his final breath beneath a mask of gold, his fate was already inscribed in the marriage contracts of ancestors who mistook purity for power. Every gilded statue of a god-faced king is a monument to this hidden corrosion. Each cartouche chiseled into stone records, not just names and victories, but the slow, deliberate burial of human health beneath a mountain of divine pretense. In that glittering hush, the bloodline thickened and the poison spread. When the line of early kings blurred into myth, Egypt's painted walls still glowed with gods in perfect form, wide shoulders, strong jaws, sun discs blazing above immortal heads. Yet, deep inside the palaces that cast shadows over the Nile, the royal flesh told a different story. Each new pharaoh stepped barefoot into golden halls already carrying a hidden rot in his marrow, his name inscribed beside ancestors whose twisted bones lay beneath temples they'd once commissioned. Among these lineages, one branch festered more openly than any before. In the choking heat of 1353 BCE, a prince was born into chambers perfumed with myrrh and guarded by jackals carved in obsidian. His cries echoed down corridors that had seen too many mothers bury infants, yet this child clung stubbornly to life. They named him Akhenaten, though the name would come later, after boyhood twisted him into something no artist could flatten into perfect symmetry. From his earliest days, the palace whispered behind curtains of linen and gold. Servants saw the strange slope of his skull, the hips too broad, the chest that swelled softly where muscle should have grown. Physicians hovered with herbs and amulets, pretending their tonics could straighten a spine that refused the shape of old statues. Priests spun myths quickly, that Ra had molded this prince in an image mere mortals could not comprehend. They draped him in silk and prayer, hoping the weight of ritual would conceal the reality of flesh. As he grew, so did the truth no tapestry could hide. In torchlight flickering against painted columns, the young prince stumbled through halls lined with ancestors who stared back in rigid perfection. Beneath the gold filigree and turquoise inlays, their portraits told lies that every flicker of his shadow betrayed. Other children of the court learned early to keep their eyes lowered when he passed, to hold their tongues when his gait faltered, when his breath rasped through narrow lungs. Inside Akhenaten's mind, the same poison seethed that twisted his bones. He carried the burden of divine bloodline, like a man chained to an ancient debt. Priests muttered blessings as if they could cauterize what centuries of incest had done. Yet the prince saw what they did not, that the truth stared back each dawn in polished bronze. No prayer could mask the swell of his ribcage, the curve of hips better suited to a queen than a king. When the crown settled on his fragile skull, the experiment reached its next phase. Pharaoh now, Akhenaten did the unthinkable. He commanded artists to abandon the lie. Paint them as they are, he ordered, though his words, unspoken in public, were driven by a body that refused to be edited. The walls of Amarna bloomed with frescoes that showed a royal family in all its uncanny reality. Elongated heads, sloping shoulders, bellies soft and round, where warriors should have worn armor. What the world would later hail as an artistic revolution was in truth an autopsy in pigment. Around him, the court shivered at this breach of illusion. Some whispered that the heretic king's new god, Aten, demanded a new face for royalty. But the god was only a vessel for what Akhenaten could no longer hide the poison in the blood made visible, raw, unpolished by centuries of chiseled lies. He wed Nefertiti, herself woven from the same tangled branches of the royal tree. Their daughters inherited the burden whole portraits show them beside their father. skulls stretched like his, bodies delicate as papyrus reeds bent under desert wind. Behind palace screens, whispers tangled with prayers. Courtiers spoke carefully of divine beauty, but servants saw girls who winced from sunlight, who stumbled on slender legs not meant to bear the crown's weight. Beyond the palace walls, the priests raged. The old gods Amen, Ra, Osiris turned their faces, or so the temples claimed, from a king who mocked the old order. But beneath the thunder of theological rebellion was something more primal, a bloodline fraying at its last threads. Akhenaten's new capital, Amarna, rose in desert isolation, a sanctuary for a dynasty devouring itself from within. Far from Thebes, far from granite temples that had hidden deformity behind perfect statues, the heretic king's city stood as a mirror, bright walls reflecting the truth that the bloodline was rotting in real time. He declared himself sole voice of the sun. He reshaped ritual to fit the body he could not change. Some historians would later say he was a visionary, the world's first monotheist. But his revolution was also a revolt against biology. If the old gods would not heal the flesh that betrayed him, perhaps a new god might show mercy. Yet Aten's mercy never came. Beneath sunlit courtyards, daughters died young or vanished from records altogether. Sons never lived long enough to inherit the throne cleanly. In hidden chambers, royal physicians scribbled frantic notes on scrolls, brittle bones, slow healing, fevers that did not break. They did not understand chromosomes or recessive traits, but they documented symptoms line by line, a record of how gold can hide rot but never cure it. And so the experiment lurched forward, a throne built on bone too fragile to hold its own myth. When Akhenaten died, the sun set on his city of truth. Amarna was left to crumble under desert winds, abandoned by priests who chiseled his name from monuments as if erasing it could unmake what generations had wrought in flesh. When the last breath of the heretic king slipped into Amarna's dry wind, the experiment did not die with him. In chambers now stripped of Aten's blazing disk, servants whispered prayers to old gods reborn from shadows. The city's sunlit murals, once raw confessions of fragile flesh, faded beneath drifting sands. But the line, poisoned long before Akhenaten's bones turned to dust, still pulsed behind palace walls. Out of this ruin stepped a boy barely more than a shadow crowned in gold, Tutankhamun. The name would echo down centuries, but in his own time, the boy was little more than a vessel for hopes too heavy for a crooked spine to bear. He entered the world already betrayed by the same blood his father had exposed to daylight. Historians would later find the secrets written in bone, a left foot twisted inward, a curved spine that carved pain into every step, a chest too narrow to cradle breath properly. In the torchlit halls of Thebes, priests declared the boy divine renewal proof that the old gods had forgiven the rebellion. Courtiers bent low, chanting praises to a child king who could not stand straight without a staff to lean on. Physicians trailed him like shadows, clutching jars of unguents and prayers. Yet each dawn began with the same struggle, to rise from silk bedding that softened nothing inside a ribcage that pressed lungs like a vice. The palace whispered. Gold poured over the boy's shoulders, heavy necklaces and crowns crafted to mask the frailty underneath. Artists sketched him as Horus reborn broad shoulders, jaw squared by the chisel's mercy. But within the marble walls, the truth clung closer than any amulet. Each court ceremony, each sacred procession meant to show a god in motion, was choreographed to disguise weakness. Servants stood just out of view, ready to steady the divine body should it falter before mortal eyes. The tomb that would one day preserve his fame began filling with symbols of power the living boy could barely wield. 130 walking sticks lined its walls when archaeologists cracked it open 3 millennia later, not mere royal scepters but crutches for a body that could not bear its own myth. Each stick whispered a truth his priests dared not speak, that the throne was a burden too heavy for bone. Akhenaten, half-sister and queen, shared his bed and his lineage, a closed loop of blood that turned love into obligation. They tried to plant seeds for the next link in the chain, but the womb, too, was poisoned by centuries of narrowed lines. Miscarriages piled up in silence. Tiny mummies, heartbreak wrapped in linen, hidden in sealed niches beside treasures meant to carry the pharaoh to eternity. Even in death, the children's bones spoke louder than any hieroglyph. The experiment had devoured itself. No marble edict could stop what the marrow had long since decided. When fever came, perhaps a simple parasite born in the Nile's stagnant warmth, his immune system, fractured by generations of incest, could not hold the line. Malaria found bones already soft, lungs already drowning in their own breath. In the last nights, Incense choked the air around him, priests muttering spells to gods who could not stitch chromosomes back together. While the desert pressed its heat against palace walls, the boy king drifted toward the same silence that had swallowed so many before him. The mask that would become his legend was hammered in haste, its gold surface bright enough to blind history for 3,000 years. Behind its polished face lay a jaw that did not close cleanly, a spine that curved like a question never answered. His burial was swift, a divine child laid among gods, swaddled in resin and linen, sealed behind stone meant to hold secrets. But the secrets never slept. They waited for a foreign pickaxe in 1922, for electric lamps and camera bulbs to pierce the darkness his ancestors thought eternal. The treasures dazzled the world, but the bones told a truer tale, brittle, twisted, a map of decisions made long before Tutankhamun took his first crippled steps across cold palace tiles. In the hush of his tomb, gold gleamed bright enough to blind generations. But hidden inside the shimmer was the echo of every forced sibling union, every priest who called deformity divine, every mother who pressed an infant to her chest and felt it slip away before dawn. The boy who inherited dust did not choose his blood, his crown, or the ruin baked into the marrow of his short life. He only bore it, step after limping step, until breath failed him and gold closed over the truth. No matter how many layers of treasure sealed him in, no wall could hold back time forever. Science would come not as priests, but as knives and microscopes, peeling linen from bone to read the ledger written in recessive genes. And in those crooked vertebrae, that inward turning foot, those fragile ribs, the truth glared brighter than any buried mask. Gold can hide rot, but bone remembers everything. Long after Tutankhamun's gold mask was sealed behind stone, the cycle that had twisted his bones did not vanish with his burial. The tomb closed, but the logic that created it never died. Priests returned to their altars, chiseling old gods back into temple walls as if repainting statues could bleach poison from royal veins. Dynasties rose and fell like the Nile's tide, each new wave learning nothing from the brittle bones of the boy pharaoh hidden beneath gilded coffins. Centuries later, when Alexander's war banners darkened Egypt's sky, the old order fractured beneath Macedonian boots. Foreign conquerors tore open ancient vaults, stared at murals that had outlasted countless mortal kings, and read them not as caution but as invitation. In these painted corridors of sibling gods and divine bloodlines, they glimpsed a secret they thought would bind the Nile to their foreign rule. What they did not see was the snare hidden in that inheritance. The Ptolemies called themselves heirs to Pharaoh's throne, but their claim did not rest on conquest alone. To rule Egypt was to become Egypt, to drink from the same poisoned well the god kings had guarded for millennia. So brothers and sisters once again stood before altars, hands clasped under stone eyes of Horus, sealing flesh into labyrinths of lineage from which there would be no easy escape. Inside palace walls of Alexandria, the cycle repeated, only faster, more methodical. Macedonian blood coiled around Egyptian superstition until the branches of family trees tangled into knots no scribe could untangle cleanly. Each generation played out the same hidden drama. Children born into corridors of gold and marble, their footsteps echoing off scrolls that mapped family lines collapsing back into themselves. Cousins became spouses. Siblings shared beds under star-painted ceilings. Political advantage was the altar where health was sacrificed over and over again. Behind closed doors, queens watched their bellies swell with hope and dread in equal measure. Each new child was a coin tossed into a well, with the gods grant strong bones this time, a jaw that fit cleanly, a mind sharp enough to wield a crown. Or would another infant slip away before its name could be etched into stone? Midwives learned to carry both cradle and shroud to each royal chamber. Physicians recorded short lives in ink that flaked away faster than the frescoes that outlasted them. By the time Cleopatra VII opened her eyes to Alexandria's salt breeze in 69 BCE, the labyrinth had nearly devoured itself. Her family tree was not a tree at all, but a circle, the same names repeating like an incantation. Uncles were fathers, sisters were mothers, nephews became heirs and husbands in the same breath. In this tangled bloodline, beauty was rumor, not guarantee. The world would remember Cleopatra as a seductress wrapped in silk and cunning, but her truest inheritance was not charm, it was the same fragile marrow that had betrayed kings before her. Unlike the pharaohs whose tombs rotted under desert sands, Cleopatra's battlefield was not bone alone, but empire. She saw what the priests would not say aloud, that her line could not hold itself together without new blood. Rome's generals offered more than armies, they were fresh veins, outsiders to dilute the poison. Her alliances with Caesar and Mark Antony were gambles of biology as much as politics. The children they gave her were proof of a possible escape from the labyrinth's stronger stock to mend cracked foundations. Yet the old order did not go quietly. Roman ambition devoured her fragile hope before it could root deeply. Caesarion, her son, with Caesar, carried promise that might have rewritten centuries of decay, but the empire would not share its future with a child half-forged from ancient curses. Rome's knives were swifter than any parasite that had undone Tutankhamun. Where incest failed, conquest finished the job. The Ptolemaic palace fell silent in the hiss of a snake's final bite, a queen's last breath tangled in silk and legend. Around her, scrolls were burned, lineages erased or absorbed into foreign titles that cared nothing for gods with falcon heads or sun discs. But beneath the marble floors, behind storerooms of gold coins and statues, the truth sat unchanged. An empire can be conquered by swords, but it can devour itself long before an enemy crosses the threshold. The Nile, unmoved by funeral barges or coronation oaths, kept rising and falling as it always had. Tombs filled with fragile bones crumbled while new rulers gave old gods new names, pretending this time the cycle would break. But the story carved in jawbones and spines lay waiting, humming beneath layers of stone and sand. Power hoarded in closed bloodlines poisons itself until bone cracks under the weight of its own legend. Long after the last queen's veins went cold beneath silk sheets and Roman steel, the empire she left behind slipped into dust and legend. Temples cracked open under centuries of sun. Desert winds carried away paint from walls that once promised eternity. But beneath stone lids and golden masks, the real story stayed sealed in bone, waiting for hands unafraid of gods to pry it loose. For centuries, the world saw only the splendor, the towering pyramids, the painted gods, the sarcophagi that gleamed like frozen sunrises. Priests, dead and dust themselves, could not protest when foreign explorers came with lanterns and chisels. They came not to pray, but to dig, to turn gold over and peer at what gold was meant to bury. And what they found spoke not in hieroglyphs, but in fractures and twisted spines. Science arrived where superstition once ruled. The scalpels that sliced linen from royal ribs found evidence the ancients could never name. DNA unwound secrets priests had shrouded in chants, bloodlines knotted too tight, genes doubled where they should have scattered, deformities whispered through generations like a curse in the marrow. Clubfoot, cleft palates, fragile bones that broke under weight that common farmers never feared. The real legacy of the god kings was a testament written not in stone but in chromosomes. Tutankhamun's fame glitters brighter than any monument, yet his skeleton is more honest than all his gold. His walking sticks, laid like scepters of a crippled god, mocked the marble inscriptions that called him immortal. Akhenaten's portraits, once thought to be wild artistic dreams, stand now as medical records painted in mineral pigment, the artist's brush catching what the priests pretended not to see. Cleopatra's tangled family tree shows that power devours itself faster than any invading army when bloodlines coil in on themselves. And so, the greatest civilization of the ancient world teaches its final lesson not through its monuments but through the cracks in its king's bones. No curse guards these tombs, only evidence, silent but stubborn. The genetic code these rulers mistook for divinity betrayed them more completely than any foreign blade could. For every stone pyramid still standing, a brittle rib lies beneath it, whispering that blood is not a throne but a debt that must be paid if arrogance outweighs wisdom. Modern eyes peer through microscopes where once priests peered at omens in bird flight. Historians and geneticists read the same bones, the ancients embalmed with so much care. And what they see is not just a tragic family, but a civilization that turned humans into test subjects for a ritual disguised as faith. The message is older than the sand and sharper than any pharaoh's blade. Bones, remember what gold tries to hide. Their legacy is this unasked for warning. Keep the blood open, the lines crossed, the circle wide. Because when power becomes a family locked behind palace doors, flesh becomes a prison for secrets no mask can forever conceal. And when that prison cracks open, as it always does, the bones beneath still tell the truth long after gold forgets what it was forged to protect. Long after the last torch dims in a museum hall, the bones still whisper beneath glass and dust. They whisper of palaces that traded fresh air for walls of marble, of crowns hammered to blind eyes to broken spines, Of gold masks soldered shut over mouths that never spoke the truth alive but speak it now in fragments of DNA. No priest remains to bless the cracked skulls. No scribe kneels to smooth the story on fresh papyrus. Instead, modern hands turn pages and peer through microscopes, tracing the lineage backward, not to worship kings, but to hear what they could never say aloud. That power locked too tightly devours itself. That blood treated as treasure becomes poison. That no lineage, no title, no mask of hammered gold can silence the ledger kept in bone. The tombs of Egypt still hold secrets not of treasure but of warning. And if the bones could speak beyond brittle ribs and jawbones that never quite closed, they would beg not for worship but for remembrance. Remembrance that the lesson is not buried with them. It lives wherever families shut doors too tightly, wherever power circles inward, wherever purity is mistaken for strength. So let the sealed chambers stay open, not just in stone but in conversation. Let these kings and queens, who could not choose their flesh, speak now through us. If their bones taught you anything, carry it forward. Uncover it for others. Leave a thought behind, a comment, a question, a truth you see beneath the gold. Because somewhere in the marrow of every story like this, history waits to remind us, bones remember what gold tries to hide.